They pushed the box toward me across the table, grinning like kids do when they think they're clever. Father's Day. Balloons, cake, a few neighbors watching. I opened the wrapping. Inside was a mug. Bright letters screamed, "World's Worst Dad." My name is Edward Miller. I'm 64 years old, a man who raised 3 kids on my own after their mother passed. My back aches when I wake, but I still mow my own lawn and fix my own roof. And that morning, my own children decided to make me the punchline. Sit back and let me tell you how they mocked me in front of everyone, and how I placed a surprise on the same table that shut their laughter down cold. Before we get too far, don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're listening from. I lifted the mug and forced a smile. "Thanks," I said. Mark, the oldest, chuckled and nudged his sister. Emma nearly doubled over laughing. Clara, the youngest, bit her lip but still smiled because the room demanded it. The neighbors clapped like it was all in good fun, but my chest was tight. I felt the ceramic heavy in my hand. Worst dad. Not once, not twice, but big, bold letters shouting the joke to anyone who walked by. "Come on, Dad," Mark said. "Drink up. It suits you." I set the mug down. My fingers left a small, wet ring on the table. They thought it was funny. They thought I wouldn't answer. But I had something waiting. The cake came next. Chocolate with white frosting, candles shaped like numbers, 6 and 4. "Blow them out, Dad," Emma said, her phone already up to film. I blew. Smoke curled, thin as thread. Everyone clapped again. Someone muttered, "World's worst dad, huh?" and laughter rippled through the group. I sat back in my chair. The rope in my chest pulled tighter. Clara leaned close. "Dad," she whispered, "they went too far." I looked at her. She looked away. After cake, Mark raised his glass. "To Dad," he said, "the man who taught us everything not to do." He roared at his own joke. Emma nearly dropped her phone. She was laughing so hard. I stayed still. I let the laughter wash over me. Each wave sharpened the shape of what I would do next. Because on the far end of the table, under a folded cloth, sat my surprise. I had placed it there the night before, knowing they wouldn't look, knowing the day would come. And when it did, no one would be laughing. The neighbors left after the cake, carrying little plates of leftovers, still chuckling about the mug. Edward stacked the dishes in silence while his children lounged in the living room. Mark stretched on the couch, his feet up. You see Dad's face when he read the mug? Priceless. Emma scrolled on her phone, showing the video clip to Clara. This will kill on social. #FatherFail or something. She laughed until she wiped her eyes. Clara didn't laugh. She set the phone down and said, "It's not funny, Emma." "Come on," Mark said. "Lighten up. He'll survive. He always does." Edward stood in the doorway, towel in hand, hearing every word. He didn't move, didn't argue. He just folded the towel neatly and placed it on the counter. He had survived worse. He could survive this too. But surviving wasn't the same as living. That night, after they left, the house was quiet. Edward sat at the table again, staring at the mug they'd left behind. The letters glared back in the dim light. World's worst dad. He turned it slowly in his hand. The ceramic was cheap, the handle rough, a throwaway joke bought from a novelty shop. But the sting it carried was heavy, heavier than the years he'd spent working double shifts, patching roofs, paying tuition, and keeping a home upright when grief threatened to tear it apart. He set the mug down and reached beneath the table. His fingers found the edge of the folded cloth. He pulled it forward an inch, enough to feel its weight. The surprise was still there, waiting. He whispered, "Not yet." The next day, Clara stopped by. She carried a bag of groceries, moving quickly into the kitchen. "Morning, Dad," she said softly. She unpacked milk, bread, fruit. "How are you?" "I've been better," Edward said. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I told them it wasn't funny. They don't listen." Edward touched her shoulder. "You don't need to carry their weight." She shook her head. "But I see it, and it makes me sick." He gave her a small smile. "One day they'll see too." She looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" He shook his head. "Eat before the milk warms." She studied him, but he didn't give her more. She let it go, for now. By Thursday, the clip had spread. Emma had uploaded it, despite Clara's protests. People in town stopped Edward on the street. "Hey, where's Dad?" one teenager yelled from a bike, laughing as he sped past. A woman at the grocery checkout smirked. "Saw the video. Your kids sure know how to joke." Edward didn't reply. He set his apples on the scale and watched the numbers rise. At home, he walked to the shed, pulled out the mower, and cut the grass until the sweat rolled down his back. Each pass of the blades left clean lines, sharp edges. Work was honest. Work didn't laugh in your face. When he finished, he sat on the porch with a glass of water, staring at the street. The mug sat on the table beside him. He let it sit there, daring the world to read it again. Sunday brought another brunch at Mark's house. Edward went, because saying no would only fuel their jokes further. The table was crowded with neighbors, friends, even a coworker of Mark's. The mug sat in the center, used as a pen holder now, bright letters flashing with every laugh. Mark raised his glass again. To Dad, proof you can raise 3 kids and still come out the world's worst at it. The table erupted. Emma filmed again, phone high. Edward's hand tightened on his fork. He felt the metal bite into his skin. He looked at Clara. She stared at her plate, cheeks flushed. Speech, Dad, Emma called. Come on, tell us how you feel about your new title. Edward rose. His chair scraped the floor. The room went still for a heartbeat. Then someone snickered. He looked at each of them in turn. His voice was calm, steady. Enjoy your meal. Then he walked out. Behind him, laughter started again, shaky at first, then louder, as if trying to cover the silence he left behind. But Clara followed him out. Dad, wait. He turned. Her eyes were sharp. You're planning something, aren't you? He looked at her a long moment. Yes. She swallowed. Will it hurt them? He shook his head. Not the way they hurt me. Then what? She pressed. He glanced back at the house. The laughter still spilled through the windows. You'll see. That night, Edward sat at his kitchen table again. The mug was there, and the cloth-covered surprise still waited beneath. He unfolded the cloth a little more, letting the corner of what lay beneath show in the dim light. It wasn't big, it wasn't flashy, but it was heavy with truth. He brushed his hand across it, then pulled the cloth back over. Not yet, he whispered again. Monday morning, the group chat lit up. Emma sent the video link. Going viral, she wrote. Mark replied with laughing emojis. Dad's famous now. Clara wrote nothing. Edward typed 3 words. Dinner, Sunday, 6. No emojis, no jokes, just words. The dots blinked. Emma, what's the occasion? Edward, you'll see. The chat went silent. Sunday came. Edward set the table himself. Plates, glasses, the plant from the porch in the middle. And under the cloth at his end, the surprise waited. At 5:30, Clara arrived first, carrying a casserole. She set it down and hugged him hard. I'll help. At 5:45, Emma and Mark arrived together, laughing at something on Mark's phone. The mug was in Mark's hand, like a trophy. Thought we'd bring it, he said. Centerpiece. Edward said nothing. He only pointed at their seats. They sat. The food smelled warm. The room was quiet except for the tick of the old clock. Edward looked at them. Eat. They ate. Small talk flickered and died. Even Emma's phone stayed face down. When the plates were cleared, Edward stood. His chair made no sound this time. He reached under the cloth, lifted the surprise, and set it on the table with a thud that made the glasses tremble. Mark frowned. Emma tilted her head. Clara's breath caught. Edward pulled the cloth away. What lay there wasn't a joke. It was the beginning of silence. Edward didn't sleep that night. He lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow above him. Every few seconds, the blades cut through the light of the street lamp. Shadow and glow, shadow and glow. His chest felt the same rhythm. The mug still sat on the counter, a silhouette against the sink. Even in the dark, he could see the letters. World's Worst Dad. At dawn, he brewed coffee and poured it into that same mug. He lifted it with steady hands, drank, and let the bitter taste stay on his tongue. If the world wanted him to carry this title, he would carry it on his terms. By mid-morning, he was on his porch, trimming the hedges. Neighbors passed by. A man across the street waved. Hey, Ed, saw that video. Your kids got you good. Edward lifted his shears, clipped another branch, and said nothing. A woman with her dog laughed as she walked past. World's worst dad, huh? Don't be too hard on yourself. Edward bent, gathered the clippings into a pile, and let the comment roll past like wind. Inside, though, the rope pulled tighter. On Wednesday, Mark came by. He carried fast food bags, grease showing through the paper. He set them on the counter like an offering. Thought you could use dinner, Mark said. He opened a box of fries and popped one in his mouth. And hey, Dad, the mug. People love it. You're trending. Did you know that? People are making duets with the video. You're practically famous. Edward didn't answer. He poured water into the kettle. Mark leaned against the counter. Don't be sore. It's just a joke. You always told us to laugh at ourselves. Edward turned, steady. I said laugh at yourself, Mark, not at someone else. Mark smirked. Same difference. Edward didn't argue. He lifted the kettle and poured the water. The hiss filled the silence. Mark laughed once, short. Lighten up, Dad. People will forget in a week. Edward stirred his tea, spoon clinking slow against the cup. I won't. Mark's smirk faltered, just a little. He grabbed his food and left without finishing it. Edward carried his tea to the study and sat at the desk. He opened the drawer, pulled out the old cloth bundle, and laid it on the wood. His fingers rested on it like a man holding a book he hadn't yet dared to read aloud. Not yet, he whispered again. By Friday, the whispers had spread further. At the hardware store, a clerk chuckled as he rang up Edward's nails and sandpaper. So Ed, worst dad, huh? Guess Father's Day was interesting. Edward slid cash across the counter without replying. He lifted the bag, heavy with tools, and left. Out in the parking lot, two young men leaned against a car, scrolling on their phones. One pointed at him. That's him. That's the guy. The other lifted his phone to snap a picture. Edward stopped, looked at them straight on, and said nothing. The phone lowered. The laughter died in their throats. He walked past them without breaking stride. Sunday came faster than it should have. Edward spent the morning cooking, filling the kitchen with the smell of roast chicken and herbs. He set the table again, each fork straight, each glass shining. The purple plant from the porch stood in the center, its leaves catching the late sun. The cloth bundle waited at his seat, heavy, silent. At 5:30, Clara arrived again, her face tense but calm. She carried a pie and set it down gently. I'll be here, she whispered. At 5:45, Emma walked in with Mark. They were quieter this time. Emma's phone was in her pocket, not in her hand. Mark didn't bring the mug. They sat. Plates clinked. Small talk rose and fell like waves too weak to reach the shore. Edward ate slowly, steady. He didn't laugh. He didn't scold. When the plates were cleared, he rose. His chair scraped softly against the floor. He reached under the cloth and brought the bundle out. He set it on the table with both hands. Mark frowned. What's that? Edward looked at them. His eyes were steady, his hands calm. The part of the story you don't know, he said. He began to unwrap it, the cloth falling back inch by inch. Emma leaned forward. Clara held her breath, and even Mark's smirk faded. What lay inside was small, simple, but heavy enough to shift the room. Edward unwrapped only part of the cloth, just enough for the edge of a leather-bound book to show, then stopped. His hands rested on it a moment, then he covered it again. Emma's mouth opened, but he cut her off. Not tonight, he said. Mark leaned back in his chair. Come on, Dad. You can't do the magician act forever. What is it? Edward looked at him, steady as stone. Patience. The words sat in the room like a weight. No one laughed. When they left that night, Clara lingered at the door. Dad, she whispered, what's in there? You'll know when it's time, he said. She nodded, though unease tugged at her eyes. The following week, the video reached even further. Edward learned of it at the post office when the clerk smirked and said, You're the mug guy, huh? My nephew sent me that clip. 1 million views already. Edward signed for his package, pressed his thumb into the receipt, and walked out without replying. But the words followed him onto the street. 2 teenagers passed, one holding a phone high. Hey, worst dad, he shouted, grinning wide, the other mimed, sipping from a mug, cackling as they walked on. Edward stopped mid-step, his shoulders tightening. He turned, not fast, just enough to let them see his eyes. The laughter shrank, thin and nervous, until the boys hurried away. The silence after was louder than their taunts. Thursday evening, Emma showed up at the house. She didn't knock, just pushed the door open. Dad, we're thinking of merch, she said, holding her phone like a prize. Worst dad shirts. People would buy them. Edward didn't move from his chair. People, he said the word flat. Yes, she insisted. Mark's friend knows printing. We could split the profit 3 ways. It could pay bills. Which bills? Edward asked. She faltered, blinking. I don't know, any of them. Edward leaned forward, elbows on his knees. And when the joke is old, what then? Emma's voice dropped. We'll think of something new. Edward shook his head. I already have. She stared at him, trying to read his tone. But he only stood and walked to the sink, rinsing his cup. Dinner Sunday? 6, he said over his shoulder. She pressed her lips tight, then left without another word. By Saturday, the town had made him a shadow of himself. At the diner, whispers followed him to the booth. A waitress chuckled as she poured his coffee. Want me to serve it in a special mug? Edward lifted his eyes to hers. Porcelain's fine. She flushed, mumbled something, and hurried away. When he left, he noticed someone had drawn on his car's dusty window. Worst, Dad. The letters smeared under his finger when he wiped them away. That night, he sat in his study and laid the cloth bundle open on the desk. The letter book gleamed under the lamp. Beside it lay a thin stack of papers, clipped and neat. He traced the edge with his finger, steady and calm. Each page was a record, payments, receipts, sacrifices they had forgotten. The ledger of years when every extra dollar went to their lives, not his. He had carried it all in silence. Now silence would carry it back to them. He closed the book, tied the cloth, and placed it in the drawer again. His heart didn't race. It beat slow, patient, like footsteps toward a door. Sunday came again, the house filled with the smell of roast and bread. Clara arrived early, helping set the table. Her face was tight, her voice low. They're still joking online, she said. Edward nodded once. And you? I don't laugh. That's enough, he said. Emma and Mark came late, laughing as they walked in. Mark carried a box. He set it on the counter with a flourish. New mugs, he announced. We ordered a batch. Want to see? Clara stiffened. You didn't. Emma chuckled nervously. It's just business, Dad. People want them. Edward stood at the head of the table, his hands folded. He looked at the box, then back at his children. His voice was low, almost a whisper. Sit. They did. Dinner passed in silence. The food was warm, but no one tasted it. Clara's hands shook slightly as she reached for her glass. When the plates were cleared, Edward pulled the cloth bundle forward. He set it on the table, untied the knot, and opened it wide this time. The leather book, the papers, the weight of years. Mark frowned. What is this? Edward met his eyes. Memory. Emma leaned forward. Dad, you're scaring me. You should be, Edward said, calm and even, because you've forgotten. He slid the first paper across the table. It was a receipt for Emma's tuition, paid in full. Her eyes darted over the numbers, her breath hitching. Another paper. Mark's medical bills from when he broke his arm, paid. Another. Clara's books, her summer camp, her first car, paid. One by one, Edward laid them down, each louder than any laugh. The room was still. The clock ticked. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows. Edward closed the book. You call me worst, but this is what worst looks like? No one answered. The mug sat on the counter, forgotten, its bright letters turned away from the table. The papers stayed on the table long after the plates were cleared. Emma stared at the slip, with her tuition written across the top. The ink faded, but the numbers sharp. Her hand hovered, wanting to touch it, but she didn't. Mark shifted in his chair, arms crossed. So what? You paid bills. That's what parents do. Edward looked at him, calm. And children don't? Mark's face flushed red. Don't twist it, Dad. We all know you weren't perfect. Edward didn't flinch. No one said perfect. I said present. The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Clara finally whispered, He's right. Emma swallowed hard, her eyes wet, but she stayed quiet. Edward gathered the papers slowly, stacking them neat. He slid them back into the leather book, tied the cloth, and placed it at his side. This is only the beginning, he said. Dinner next week, same time. Mark barked a laugh, too sharp. So we're doing weekly sermons now? Edward's voice was steady. No lessons. And there's more than one. The next day, Edward walked through town with his grocery bag under one arm. Conversations hushed when he passed. A man by the barber shop leaned out and called, Hey Ed, seen your kid's store? They're selling those mugs now, $10 each. Edward didn't look up. He walked home, set the groceries down, and opened the laptop. Clara had helped him set up months before. His fingers moved slow but sure. He typed the website address his neighbor had whispered about. There it was, rows of mugs, shirts and caps. World's worst Dad splashed across them all. His own children had put his humiliation up for sale. Edward's jaw tightened. He clicked through each page, his breath steady, his hands calm. Then he closed the laptop and pushed it away. "Next Sunday," he murmured. On Thursday, Clara stopped by again. She looked exhausted, her hair pulled back, her shoulders tense. She put a small envelope on the table. "What's this?" Edward asked. She looked down. "I tried to buy out the store link. I paid a friend to take it down. But they keep putting it back up. Mark says it's too profitable." Edward touched the envelope, then slid it back to her. "Keep your money. It's not your debt to pay." Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how you're still standing. I'm ashamed for them." Edward reached across and put his hand over hers. "Shame is heavy. Don't carry theirs. Just carry yours and put it down when it gets too much." She nodded, biting her lip. Friday night, Edward heard shouting outside. Teenagers again, riding bikes up and down the street. One called, "Hey, where's Dad? Nice yard." Another whistled. Edward stood at the window, the leather book in his lap. He didn't move. He let their laughter echo off the siding of the house, let it wash through him. Then he opened the book, pulled one paper free, and held it under the lamplight. It was a bank receipt from years ago, one of dozens. Each one told the same story, sacrifice carved into numbers. The laughter outside dimmed as the bikes rolled away. The quiet left behind was his answer. He folded the paper back in place, closed the book, and whispered, "Soon." Sunday came again. This time, Clara wasn't the first to arrive. Mark showed up early, grinning, carrying a laptop. He set it on the table, spun it toward Edward. "Check it out. 200 sales this week. We're getting rich, Dad. You should thank us." Edward looked at the screen, the mugs, the shirts, his face turned into a meme. He looked at Mark. "Thank you," he said quietly. Mark laughed. "See? He gets it now." Clara arrived moments later, her eyes dark when she saw the screen. "Mark, stop it." Emma came last, phone already buzzing with notifications. She tossed it onto the counter, not meeting Edward's eyes. Dinner was tense. No one joked. The food passed from hand to hand without a word. When the table was clear, Edward rose again. He placed the cloth bundle in the center, untied it, and drew out a smaller box he hadn't shown before. Mark leaned forward. "What now?" Edward looked at him, steady. Another piece of memory. He opened the box and set out 3 old photographs. One of Emma on her graduation day, cap crooked, Edward standing behind her with tired eyes and a proud smile. One of Mark as a boy, his arm in a cast, Edward holding him steady while the doctor wrapped it. One of Clara, age 10, asleep in the back seat of the old car after a long drive, Edward's hand on the wheel, face set against the night. He slid them across the table. "You don't remember these, but I do." Emma picked hers up with trembling fingers. Mark stared at his, jaw tight. Clara touched hers and let out a shaky breath. Edward gathered the box again, closed it, and tied the cloth back around the bundle. "Next week," he said. "Same time." Emma whispered, "Dad, what are you doing?" "Showing you what worse really looks like," Edward said. The days crawled by until the next Sunday. Edward kept to himself, working in the garden, polishing the old tools, mending the fence. Every task was slow, deliberate, patient. Neighbors watched him, whispering behind hedges, their laughter thinner now. At the diner, the waitress no longer joked. She set his coffee down quiet, eyes lowered. The words "Where's Dad" still hung in the air, but softer, like smoke that refused to clear. Edward drank his coffee, paid in cash, and left. His hands were steady. His eyes saw further than they let on. By the next week, Edward's name wasn't just a joke in town. It was a brand. Flyers with the mug printed on them were taped to lampposts. A local bar had even written on its chalkboard outside, "Father's Day Special. Bring your worst dad, and he drinks for free." Edward passed it on his morning walk, his hands clasped behind his back. People sitting at tables outside chuckled when they noticed him. One man raised his glass and called, "Hey, Ed, we saved you a seat." Edward didn't break stride. His steps were even, his shadow long in the morning sun. The bar laughter died quick, replaced by whispers. At home he trimmed his roses. The shears clicked, steady and patient. Clara arrived with groceries, her face stormy. "Dad, have you seen what they're doing?" she asked. "I've seen," Edward said. "They're making money off you, off humiliating you. It's disgusting." Edward set the shears down and brushed his hands together. Humiliation has a short life. Truth doesn't. She stared at him. "You sound like you already know how this ends." "I do." Her eyes softened. She touched his arm. Then let me help. Edward shook his head. No, they need to see with their own eyes, not through yours. That Sunday, dinner was different. Edward set out more chairs. The table stretched long, candles flickering low. Neighbors were invited this time, 2 old friends from the church, Mr. Jensen and his wife. When Mark and Emma arrived, their smiles froze. What's all this? Emma asked, glancing at the extra chairs. Witnesses, Edward said simply. They sat stiffly. Clara helped serve, her hands careful as she passed the plates. Halfway through the meal, Mark couldn't hold his tongue. Dad, this is ridiculous. You're parading us in front of people like we're children. Edward looked at him. When you act like children, you'll be seen as children. Emma flushed, her fork clinking against her plate. After dinner, Edward brought out the cloth bundle again. He opened it in front of everyone, revealing not just the book and papers, but a small, weathered box. This house, Edward said, was built on sacrifice. He slid a paper across the table toward the neighbors. Every beam, every shingle, paid with nights I didn't sleep, shifts I didn't want, aches I still carry. They forget. You should remember. Mr. Jensen adjusted his glasses, scanning the paper. His wife's lips pressed tight. I remember, Ed, she said softly. We all saw what you carried. Emma's face crumpled, shame creeping in. Mark scoffed. So what? You want applause? Edward's voice was calm. No, just truth. He packed the papers back in silence, tied the cloth, and set it aside. The neighbors left with heavy eyes. Emma avoided his gaze. Mark muttered curses under his breath. Clara hugged Edward tight before leaving, whispering, They're cracking. I can see it. Edward nodded once. Next week. Monday morning, Edward found spray paint on his fence. 3 words in sloppy red. Worst dad forever. He stood there a long time, the morning air biting cold. Then he fetched a bucket, soap, and a brush. He scrubbed until the wood was clean, the paint washing down into the dirt. His arms burned, his back ached, but the fence stood bright again. When he finished, he sat on the porch, sweat running down his neck. The mug sat on the railing. He lifted it, drank his water from it, and set it down with a sharp tap. His phone buzzed. Mark, in the family chat, Don't forget dinner Sunday. Edward typed back, I won't. By Thursday, the tension in town had shifted. Some people still joked, but fewer laughed. More watched in silence when he passed. A rumor had spread that Edward was planning something, that the weekly dinners weren't just dinners. Emma showed up unannounced again, her face pale. She sat at the table, wringing her hands. Dad, please, whatever you're doing, stop. People are talking. They say you're going to ruin us. Edward studied her. You ruined yourselves when you forgot who you were. She started to cry, soft and broken. I didn't mean it. Edward's eyes didn't soften. Words don't build. Actions do. She buried her face in her hands. Clara came in from the kitchen and wrapped her arms around her sister. Emma clung to her, sobbing. Edward turned away. He had heard apologies before. They only mattered when followed by change. Sunday arrived again. This time, the house was full. More neighbors. 2 of Edward's old co-workers. Even the pastor from church. Clara helped serve, her eyes shining with nerves. Mark walked in late, scowling when he saw the crowd. So this is it? You're dragging the whole town into your circus? Edward met his eyes. No, I'm reminding them what silence looks like. Dinner passed tense, conversations muted, no one joked. The mug wasn't on the table this time. When the plates were cleared, Edward rose. He carried the cloth bundle to the table, untied it, and opened it wide. Paper spread like a fan, receipts, photos, records, sacrifices, written in ink. He spoke slow, his voice steady as stone. This is not a sermon. This is not a circus. This is memory. And you forgot it. He laid out Emma's tuition again, Mark's bills, Clara's childhood summers. Then he placed the box in the center, unopened. Everyone leaned forward, breath held. Edward's hand rested on the lid. Next week, he said, it ends. The room was silent. Even Mark didn't speak. Emma stared at the table, her tears falling soundless. Clara's hand trembled in her lap. Edward closed the box, tied the cloth, and lifted it under his arm. The rope inside him held, and the silence grew heavier than laughter ever had. The week after Edward's words, next week, it ends, the town seemed to shift. Laughter didn't come as easy when he walked past. People still glanced, still whispered, but the sharp edges of their voices had dulled. What replaced them was curiosity, and under that, unease. At the market, a woman who used to giggle at the mug video stood in line behind him. She didn't laugh this time. She cleared her throat and said, "Ed, is it true you're planning something?" Edward looked at her, the weight of his silence steady. "I'm planning the truth," he said. Her eyes widened, but she didn't ask more. Mark, on the other hand, grew more restless. He called on Wednesday, his voice tight. "Dad, this has gone too far. You're making us look bad." Edward sat in his study, the leather book open on the desk, the papers fanned before him. "I haven't made you anything," he said. "You did that yourself." "You're enjoying this," Mark snapped. Edward's tone didn't rise. "Enjoyment has nothing to do with it. This is weight, and you'll feel it until you learn to carry it." Mark cursed under his breath and hung up. Emma came the next day, her steps hesitant, her face pale. She carried the infamous mug in her hands like an offering. She set it on the table between them. "Dad," she whispered, "I'm sorry." Edward studied her. "Sorry doesn't erase." "I know," she said, tears slipping down her cheeks. "But I don't know how to take it back." Edward placed his hand on the mug, turned it so the words faced away. "You don't take it back. You build something better." Her shoulders sagged, relief and shame mixing on her face. She nodded, clutching her arms around herself. By Friday, Clara visited again. She stood at the door with a folded letter in her hand. "Dad," she said softly, "the pastor told me people are expecting more than a dinner. They think it'll be a spectacle." Edward's eyes held hers. "It will be quiet. They won't understand that until it happens." She handed him the letter. "Read it when you're ready. It's from me." He tucked it into the leather book without opening it. "I will." She looked like she wanted to say more, but instead, she hugged him tight and left. Saturday night, Edward set the table himself. He polished the glasses until they caught the lamplight, set the forks and knives in perfect rows. The purple plant stood at the center, taller now, leaves reaching. He placed the cloth bundle at his seat. Beside it, he set a single candle, unlit. Then he sat in the quiet house and listened to the clock tick. Every second sounded like a step closer to the end. When the hour grew late, he carried the mug to the sink. He washed it, dried it, and set it on a shelf. Not as a trophy, not as a curse, just as a cup. Then he blew out the lamp and went to bed. Sunday came. The air was heavy, thick with clouds that promised rain. By noon, people were already whispering on the street. Neighbors peeked through curtains. Some dressed and walked toward Edward's house, drawn by the weight of expectation. At 5, Clara arrived first. She hugged him quietly, her eyes steady. "I'm here." Edward nodded. Emma and Mark came together, not laughing this time. Their faces were pale, their steps slow. By 6, the house was full. Neighbors, friends, the pastor, Mr. Jensen and his wife, all seated around the long table. The meal passed in near silence. Forks scraped plates. Glasses clinked, but no one spoke much. Even Mark stayed quiet, his smirk gone. Emma stared at her lap, pushing food around her plate. When the plates were cleared, Edward rose. He lifted the cloth bundle, set it in the center, and untied it. The leather book lay there, the photographs, the box. The room held its breath. Edward looked around the table, his eyes passing over every face, his children, his neighbors, his friends. His voice was calm, low, steady. "This ends tonight." He opened the box. Edward's fingers rested on the lid of the box, but he didn't lift it yet. He let the silence stretch, thick enough to press on every chest in the room. The only sound was the steady tick of the clock on the wall and the faint patter of rain starting outside. Mark finally shifted in his chair, his voice sharp in the quiet. "If this is another lecture, spare us." The pastor cleared his throat softly. "Mark, hush." Edward's gaze didn't move from his son. "This isn't a lecture. It's a mirror. You don't like what you see." Emma's hands twisted in her lap. Her eyes brimmed, but she said nothing. Clara sat rigid, her back straight, eyes fixed on the box like she knew something inside it would decide the shape of all their futures. Edward's hands were steady as he slid the box toward the center of the table. The cloth still clung to its sides. He folded it back inch by inch, deliberate, letting the suspense weigh heavier with every movement. He didn't open the lid yet. Instead, he reached for the leather book. He untied its cord, opened it, and laid out one more set of papers. Different this time. They weren't receipts or tuition stubs. They were letters. "While you laughed," Edward said, his voice calm and low, "I wrote. While you forgot, I remembered. Every word I never said sits here." He slid one letter across to Emma, another to Mark. He kept the third closed, his hand resting on it. Emma's hand shook as she unfolded hers. The ink was faded, but the handwriting steady. Her breath hitched as she read, her lips trembling. Mark opened his roughly, eyes darting over the page. His jaw tightened. This is manipulation." Edward met his eyes. "No, it's memory. Yours to keep or yours to burn. Either way, it will not change what happened." The room was still. Even the rain outside seemed to pause. Edward closed the book again, tied it neatly, and placed it back beside him. Only then did he lay his hand once more on the lid of the box. "This," he said quietly, "is the last piece." He didn't open it yet. He looked to Clara. "You've carried yourself with quiet. That matters." She blinked quickly, holding back tears. "Dad, whatever it is, show them. They need to see." Edward nodded once. His fingers pressed on the lid, and the faint scrape of wood against wood echoed in the hushed room. The box shifted. The lid lifted a fraction, then settled back. Edward wasn't rushing. He wanted the weight to settle on them, to make them feel the weight the way he had felt it all those years. Mark muttered, "Always the drama," but his voice had no bite now. Emma reached for Clara's hand under the table, her grip tight. Edward breathed once, steady and slow. His eyes scanned the table one last time, landing on each face. His voice came out softer than ever, almost a whisper, but every word cut clear through the silence. "When this opens, there will be no more laughter." The lid began to rise. Edward lifted the lid all the way this time. The hinges groaned softly, like the box itself had waited years to speak. Inside lay neat bundles wrapped in brown paper, each tied with twine. The rain outside grew heavier, pattering against the windows, as if the house wanted to drown out the moment. He reached in and pulled out the first bundle. He set it on the table, untied the twine, and peeled back the paper. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Edward spread them slowly, one by one, across the table. Emma's childhood birthday parties, with cakes he'd baked himself. Mark's high school football games. Edward standing behind the bleachers with a proud but tired smile. Clara's piano recital. Edward holding a bouquet of flowers too large for his hands. Each photo was evidence. Each photo said, "I was there. I never left." Emma covered her mouth, tears spilling as she picked up one after another. Mark leaned forward despite himself, his bravado cracking. Clara sat frozen, her eyes wide, her hands clasped so tight her knuckles were white. Edward's voice was calm, steady. "You made me a punchline. You turned me into a brand. But this," he tapped the photographs gently, "is the story you never told, the one you erased with a mug." The pastor's eyes brimmed as he leaned forward. "Edward, this is powerful." Edward didn't answer. He set out the second bundle. He unwrapped it to reveal old notebooks, the covers worn, the pages filled with his handwriting. "Journals," he said simply. "Every night I wrote what I gave up, what I feared, what I carried." Mark snorted, but it was hollow. "So what? Diaries? That doesn't change anything." Edward's gaze held him steady. "It changes everything, because when silence ends, the truth speaks." He opened one of the journals, reading a line aloud. "Worked 12 hours today. Back hurts. Emma's shoes worn through. Bought her a new pair instead of fixing the truck." Emma burst into quiet sobs, her shoulders shaking. Edward closed the journal, placed it gently back into the bundle, and moved to the third. This time it was smaller, sealed envelopes, each with a name. He slid them forward. "Your turn to read." Emma reached with trembling hands. Clara hesitated, then picked hers up. Mark glared at his, but took it anyway. They didn't open them yet. Their eyes stayed fixed on Edward, waiting. Edward leaned back, his hands resting calmly on the table. "There's more," he said. "But not all at once. You will see it piece by piece, and when the last page turns, you'll understand why this ends tonight." The rain drummed harder against the house. The candles flickered, shadows dancing across the faces around the table. No one spoke. No one dared. Edward closed the lid of the box again, leaving the rest inside hidden. His eyes swept the room, his voice low but steady. "You gave me a title I didn't deserve. Now I'll give you one you'll never forget." Edward kept the lid closed after the last line, letting the weight of the unopened bundle sit like a stone in the middle of the table. The rain softened to a whisper. Forks lay still, breaths slowed, no one moved. "Open yours," he said at last, looking at Emma. Her fingers shook as she broke the seal on her envelope. Paper rasped. She slid the letter out and unfolded it. The room watched her eyes move. Her throat clicked when she swallowed. She read a few lines in silence. Then her lip trembled. "Dad," she whispered, "did you write this the year I moved out?" "Yes," Edward said. She nodded, eyes on the page. "You said—" Her voice thinned. She tried again. "You wrote, 'I packed the boxes slow so I wouldn't forget the weight.'" She blinked hard, then kept going. "You asked me for $20 for gas. I gave you 50. You told me I spoil you. I told you spoiling is when you don't show up. I am showing up." Her shoulders shook once. She covered her mouth and stared at the table. Mark turned his envelope over in his palm like it might bite. He slid a thumb under the flap and ripped it open. He read faster, jaw tight. The letters on his page were short, blunt, no soft edges. "What's it say?" he snapped, as if angry at the paper. "Whatever it says," Clara murmured, not looking up. Mark's eyes didn't leave the page. He wrote, "You want to be seen. So did I. I chose my children." "You chose a camera. Put it down." Mark let out a breath that sounded like a laugh but wasn't. "You think one letter fixes anything?" "No," Edward said. "But it opens a door." "Always doors," Mark muttered, but his hand folded the letter back along its creases, careful without meaning to. Clara opened hers last. Her letter was shorter than the others. She read it and smiled a thin, sad smile. He wrote, "You hold quiet like a bowl. Don't let anyone dump their noise into it." She set the paper down and slid her hand toward Edward's. He didn't take it, but his fingers twitched like they wanted to. The pastor cleared his throat softly. "There's more," he said, not as a question, but because everyone could feel it. "There is," Edward said. He reached back into the box and lifted a small linen pouch. It clinked faintly when he set it down. He untied the string and poured out 3 small objects onto the table: a key, a folded square of cloth with a button sewn to it, and a brass washer smoothed by years of fingers. Emma tilted her head. "What are those?" "Pieces," Edward said. He touched the key. "This was from the shop I cleaned at night when you were little. The boss gave it to me because I never missed. I kept it after they closed down, to remember doors I had to open without anyone seeing." He tapped the cloth. "This came off your mother's winter coat the night you had a fever, Emma. I sewed it back on at 3 in the morning after the medicine took. The thread broke the next day. I sewed it again." He put a finger on the washer. "This fell from Mark's bicycle when his chain snapped at the stop sign." He cried. "I picked him up, fixed the chain with this, and pushed him home." Mark reached out like he might touch the washer, then drew his hand back. "These are small," Edward said quietly, "but small is what you forget first." No one spoke. The rain picked up again, tapping the window in a steady hush. Candles bent, then straightened. "I have enough for every Sunday left in me," Edward said, "but we don't have that many Sundays, and laughter runs faster than memory. So we hurry, just a little." He closed the pouch and slid it back into the box. He left the photographs out. He left the letters where they were. He placed the journals back into one bundle and tied it with twine. "Next week," he said, "early, 5:30. Mark's mouth opened. "Why early?" "Because you come tired," Edward said, "and I want your eyes clear." Emma nodded. "We'll be here." Clara squeezed his forearm once. Her fingers were warm. Neighbors rose and left in a slow drift, hats in hands, eyes avoiding the mug on the shelf. Mr. Jensen lingered at the door. "Good work," he said softly, like a man complimenting a straight fence post. Edward nodded. When the house emptied, Edward gathered the letters that were not his children's and placed them back in the leather book. He returned the key, the button cloth, the washer to the pouch. He closed the lid and felt, through the wood, the weight of everything that still waited. He turned the candles out with 2 soft breaths. Smoke curled, thin and gray. He pressed his palms flat on the table and left them there a few seconds, as if steadying the wood. Then he carried the box back to the study and set it on the desk. The room looked at him, even in the dark. He looked back until his eyes watered, then he shut the door. In the night, wind pushed at the house. The elm outside rubbed its leaves together like hands. Monday afternoon, Edward walked past the bar again. The chalkboard out front had a new message. Father Figure Friday. Bring your dad. Someone had drawn a crude mug with a frown on it. Two men at a table glanced at Edward and then away, as if their eyes had touched something hot. Edward kept walking. He moved like a man who knew how far to put his feet apart on a ladder. At the hardware store, the same clerk who once joked was quiet now. "Morning, Ed," he said, voice careful. "Need anything else?" "Brushes?" Edward said. "2, soft bristles." "4?" "For paint," Edward said. "4 words." The clerk blinked, like he'd been turned toward sun. He brought the brushes and said, "They're on the house." Edward paid anyway. On Wednesday, a car slowed in front of Edward's yard. A woman in scrubs rolled her window down and said, "Sir, I just wanted to say, my father would have liked your dinners." "Bring him next time," Edward said. "He passed," she said, and smiled small, "but I will bring my brother. He laughs too much." Edward nodded. "We have chairs." She drove on, tears bright in her eyes, not sad exactly, just wet with something that needed washing. Thursday evening, Emma sent a message in the family chat. "I shut the store." 10 minutes later, another. "I refunded orders. Not all, but some. I'm trying." Mark read it and didn't reply. A minute after that, a new message appeared. "We'll be on time Sunday." Clara reacted with a heart. Edward, after a long minute, typed, "Good." Sunday arrived with a sky that couldn't pick a color. The air smelled like rain that hadn't yet fallen. Edward washed the plates, dried them until they squeaked, and set them in a neat stack. He put the purple plant in the center of the table and turned it so the strongest leaf faced the door. He set 2 extra chairs on the ends because sometimes people come who did not say they would, and it is good to be ready for the ones who did not say. At 5:15, a knock. Mr. Jensen stood there, but he had brought someone, his son, a big man with a smaller man's eyes. "He'll listen," Jensen said. The son looked at his boots and nodded. At 5:20, a woman from the church arrived with her mother, who moved slow and gentle. At 5:25, 2 boys from down the street came, hats in hands, cheeks red, with last week's spray paint. They didn't speak. They stood by the doorway until Edward pointed to 2 chairs. They sat. At 5:31, Emma walked in with a casserole and a broom. She didn't explain the broom. She leaned it against the wall and asked where to put the dish. "Any place," Edward said. She set it down and looked, for the first time since the mug, like someone whose shoes fit. Mark came last, right on 5:30, hands in pockets, mouth flat. He didn't look at anyone too long. He went to the sink, washed his hands without being asked, dried them on a towel, folded the towel, put it back crooked, straightened it, then turned around. "I'm here," he said. Edward nodded. "I see." They ate. The boys from down the street barely touched their food. The old mother hummed under her breath like a kettle. The pastor bowed his head before the first bite, without being told to, and didn't make a big thing of it. When the last plates were set aside, Edward lifted the box. The leather squeaked. He set it down gentle, so the wood wouldn't feel slammed. He didn't untie anything yet. "Tonight," he said, "you will open your envelopes." Emma's hands went to her chest. "Here." "Here," Edward said. He slid the 3 torn envelopes back to their owners. "Read the last page, out loud." Emma looked at Clara first, then at Edward. She unfolded hers and found the final sheet. She cleared her throat. "You wrote," she said, eyes tracing the line, "if you have to choose between being clever and being kind, pick kind even when it costs. Clever fades, kind lasts." The old mother on the end nodded so slow it felt like a tree shifting. Mark read next. He had to find the place because his had more crossings out. He read without his usual speed, each word like a brick. "You think film and jokes make you big. They make noise. Real big is small. Real big is carrying things no one will clap for. Start with one thing. Carry it." Clara read last, voice steady. "Quiet is not the same as weak. Use it like a tool. Don't let people pour their mess into it. Make them hold their own weight." People in the room breathed out like they had been underwater too long. Edward put the envelopes aside. He untied the first bundle of journals and pushed one toward Mark. "Pick a page." Mark hesitated, then opened to where the spine wanted to fall. He read, not loud, but enough for the table. "Worked 2 shifts, bought Emma's coat. Clara needs braces. Mark wants a new glove. We can't do all 3. Coat now. Glove when the overtime comes. Braces when the tax return lands." He blinked hard, and the page blurred. He didn't make a joke about it. Edward nodded, neither proud nor bitter. That is what fathers do. Emma reached for a photo without being told. It was the one of her holding up a crooked cake. "You baked that," she said. "I did," Edward said. "It leaned," she said, like a confession. "It tasted good," Edward said. She laughed once, a clean sound that had dust in it still. The boys from down the street stared at the pictures like they were watching a kind of TV nobody sells. One nudged the other and whispered too loud, "My dad never," then stopped, afraid. Edward looked at him and shook his head small, not to scold, but to say, "Don't break yourself in my room." The boy nodded like he understood. Mark stood up, too fast, chair legs squealing. "I need air," he said. He stepped into the hall, then the porch. He didn't go far. Through the open door they could see him standing with his hands on the rail, looking at nothing. Emma reached under her chair and took the broom. She looked at it like she had forgotten it was there. "I brought this to sweep," she said. "I didn't know why, I just brought it." "Start with the porch," Edward said. She went out. No one made a joke about sweeping speeches or sweeping gestures. The broom made a soft shh sound against the wood. Mark stepped aside so she could pass. He didn't move like a man in her way. He moved like the door she was going through. Clara rose and began to stack plates. The boys jumped up to help, clumsy but eager. The old mother hummed again. Mr. Jensen dried a glass with a towel that had nothing left to give. Edward stayed at the head of the table, hands flat, watching the room carry itself. He did not feel lighter. He felt right-sized. When the dishes were done and the table bare, he reached into the box and took out something no one had seen yet, a small wooden frame wrapped in brown paper and tied with thin string. He didn't open it. He set it in the center of the table on the place where the plant usually sat. "We aren't at the end," he said, "but we are close." Mark came back inside and sat down slow. He looked like someone had pressed a thumb on the middle of his chest and kept it there. "What is it?" he asked, nodding at the package. "The thing I will show you when your hands are ready," Edward said. "How will we know?" Emma asked from the doorway. The broom bristled down. A dust line kneaded her feet. "You'll know because the room will be quiet enough to hear it," Edward said. They all listened. Only rain and breath and the clock. "Not yet," the room said. Edward stood and carried the box back to the study with the same careful grip he had used the first night. The boys watched him like they were watching a man carry a sleeping child. Before he shut the study door, he hesitated, then left it a finger's width open. The smell of old paper slipped into the hall like a letter slid under a door. During the week, the town shifted another small degree. The bar's chalkboard read, "Nothing funny, just live music Thursday." The hardware clerk asked about paint in a flat voice, like a man who decided to be decent, because it cost less than being cruel. The woman in scrubs waved when she drove by, and her brother sat straighter beside her. On Friday, a new thing, a small cardboard box on Edward's porch, no name. Inside, a mug, plain, white, no words. A note, "Cup for a man, a person you don't know." Edward smiled without showing his teeth. He washed the mug, dried it, set it next to the other. Saturday night, Mark came alone. He knocked and didn't wait for a shout. He stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands and said, "I turned off the store. For real this time." "I know," Edward said. "People told me before you did." Mark's mouth twitched. "Of course they did." He shifted, found nothing to do with his hands, then said, "I went to the bar, told them to wipe the board. They asked if you were going to sue them." He laughed once, no joy in it. "I told them you don't do that. You just look at people until they see themselves." Edward poured tea in 2 mugs, one plain, one that once said the worst. He turned the worst one so the words faced him, not Mark. "Sit," he said. They sat. They didn't fix anything with talk. They didn't try, they drank. The steam rose like breath in cold, then faded. On Sunday, no one was late. Even the boys showed up 5 minutes early, hair combed like they were going to court. The old mother brought bread wrapped in a towel. Mr. Jensen wore his best shirt so often it had become his regular shirt. Edward set the small wrapped frame in the center again. He did not touch the string. They ate, they cleared, they sat. "Now?" Emma asked. "Close," Edward said. "What's missing?" the pastor asked, a half smile at the corners of his mouth, like he already knew. "No phones," Edward said. Every head turned toward Mark. He reached into his pocket and placed his phone in the middle of the table. Emma's phone followed. Clara's, though it had not rung, went next. The boys didn't have phones. One of them set his hat there instead, serious as if it counted. Edward nodded. "Better." He slid the frame toward him and put one nail under the knot, lifting the string up enough to slip it loose without breaking it. He did not open the paper. "Almost," he said. Mark stared at the package, then at his hands. He stood, walked to the sink, and washed his hands again. He dried them on the towel, folded it better this time, and set it down square. He came back, sat, and put both palms on the table. He said, not loud, "I am sorry." He didn't dress it, he didn't repeat it, he let it sit. Emma put her hand on his. Clara put hers on top. The boys held themselves very still, as if moving would break the thin glass of the moment. It held. Edward's eyes closed for a second, like a man who had just set a heavy box on a high shelf. When he opened them, they were wet in a way that did not spill. "Soon," he said. "The thing will open soon." He stood, lifted the wrapped frame, and without untying it, carried it to the mantel. He set it there, center, above the empty space where one day he might hang it. The room exhaled. People stood. Plates clinked in the sink. The old mother hummed again, a different tune, light as sugar on bread. On their way out, Mark stopped at the mug shelf. He touched the plain mug and left the worst one alone. He looked at Edward and said, "Tomorrow, I'll fix the fence where those kids painted. The paint bleeds if you don't seal the grain." "I know," Edward said. "I know you know," Mark said. He left. Edward stayed by the table after the door closed. He ran his thumb along the grain, back and forth, like checking for splinters. The house smelled like roasted herbs and wet coats, and the lemon oil he used on Sundays. The clock ticked, 2 more ticks than he thought it would. He went to the study and set the box on the desk. He opened it, he took out the linen pouch and weighed it in his palm. He set it back. He took out the journals and slid them into a drawer. He lifted the photographs and held one up, Emma with the crooked cake, and put it back without sighing. Then he took out one last envelope, one no one had seen, one he had written to himself 10 years ago, for when the world will only hear a hammer. He didn't open it. He tucked it under the wrapped frame on the mantel so it would warm there until the room wanted it. He turned off the lamp. He stood in the dark until his eyes made the shapes by memory. He slept. Monday morning the sun rose slow but true. The bar's chalkboard had a drawing of a guitar now. The hardware clerk asked about weather like an old friend. The woman in scrubs drove by again, but this time she honked and kept going because some things don't need stopping for. A package arrived, brown paper, long. Inside, a name plaque, carved from wood, hand-cut letters. Father's table. No note. Edward ran his fingers over the edges and felt where the knife had hesitated at the turn of the R. He smiled small and set it aside. Tuesday, someone slid an envelope through the mail slot. Inside were crumpled bills. 25, 5, 1 and a note in block letters. For what I took from you with a can of paint. Sorry. No name. Edward walked to the fence and pressed the bills under a stone on the yard bench. He would give it to the boys when the room told him to. Wednesday, Clara came with Cal. No, in this story there is no Cal. Her hands were empty, except for a jar of jam. She put it on the counter and said, "We are almost there, aren't we?" "We are," Edward said. "What happens after?" she asked. "We eat," Edward said. "We wash dishes. We sleep." She laughed, short and bright. Good. Thursday, Emma returned the broom. It was cleaner than when she borrowed it. She hung it on the hook just so, took it down, hung it again straighter, and nodded. "I told Mark we're done with jokes," she said. "I heard," Edward said. Friday night, Edward stood on the porch and watched the sky hold its pink a little too long like it didn't want to give up the day. He thought of the frame on the mantel. He thought of the letters. He thought of the mug in its place that was not center. He went inside, set water to boil, and sat at the table with his hands around the cup when it steamed. He let the steam wet his face. He let it dry. He said to no one, "Soon." And the house, which had learned his voice, said back in the way houses do, with wood and air and light. Edward stood at the head of the table, the wrapped frame in his hands. No one moved. The rain eased outside, leaving only the tick of the clock and the sound of breath. He set the frame down in the center. His fingers pulled the string free. The paper fell away with a soft rip. Inside was not a photo of his children, not a painting, not a joke. It was a document, bold letters, clear even in the candlelight. The seal at the bottom gleamed red. The Miller Foundation, established June 15th in honor of Evelyn and Edward Miller. Emma gasped. Clara covered her mouth. Mark leaned forward, eyes wide. Edward spoke quiet, steady. "While you laughed, I built this. Every shift, every cutback, every night I stayed awake. Not for mugs, not for likes, for this." He slid the frame so they could read the lines beneath. Funding secured. Trust protected. House transferred. Education endowment guaranteed. Emma whispered, You put it all in a foundation?" "Yes," Edward said. "Not 1 cent is mine. Not 1 cent is yours. It belongs to something that will outlive us all." Mark's face drained. "The house." "Gone from your hands," Edward said. "Safe from your games, locked where you cannot sell it, film it, mock it. The doors will stay open for those who need them, not for those who waste them." The neighbors leaned in, eyes wide, murmurs spreading like fire in dry grass. Edward's hand pressed flat on the frame. "You gave me a mug that said worst. Tonight I give you the truth. Worst is not a father who pays and stays. Worst is children who turn sacrifice into spectacle. You will not do it again, because there is nothing left here for you to sell." Silence hit harder than thunder. Emma sobbed into her hands. Clara bowed her head, tears spilling onto her lap. Mark sat frozen, staring at the seal, the reality sinking in. Edward lifted the frame back into his arms. He carried it to the mantel and set it above the table. His voice was low, final. "This is my last gift. A wall you cannot break, a name you cannot erase." No one spoke, no one laughed. The room was still. The only sound was the clock ticking, steady as his breath. Edward turned, picked up the mug from the shelf, and set it down empty in the middle of the table. The ugly words faced his children. "Drink from that if you want," he said, "but the well is dry." He walked to the door, opened it, and let the cool night air flow in. The guests rose one by one, filing out in silence. Behind him, his children sat staring at the mug, at the frame, at the weight of everything they had mocked. Edward stepped onto the porch. The rain had stopped. The air smelled clean. The rope inside him held firm. That was enough.
If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe and join Taste of Revenge family, and share your impressions of the story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on one of the boxes on the right. Thank you for watching to the end.